started in a little bit.
Getting off the team. Okay, absolutely.
All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining today. It's right at 2 o'clock, and we have a full agenda. So we'll go ahead and start on time. I'm Jason Ryan, Chair of the Task Force. It's good to see so many familiar faces in the room again for the first time this year. I know there's been a lot of work in the background, but we haven't been getting together since the day one of phase one of the workshop started, so thank you all for being here. Just a reminder that we have an antitrust document that we go over at the beginning of every meeting. I won't read it word for word today, but remember the antitrust admonition that we will conduct ourselves in the task force, including in today's workshop, consistent with that admonition that we've gone over. Nothing here today should violate antitrust rules, including any conversations that you all have, both in today's meeting and outside of today's meeting. We've got an agenda up on the screen. Hopefully everybody on the teams can see it. We are recording the meeting so that if those of you that weren't able to be here in person, or if you have colleagues that want to catch up on it, it will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after today's meeting. There's a surprisingly high number of people that actually watch our meetings. So
Free advertising.
Yeah, but it's because of the good stuff that we're accomplishing for the state and for the market. So just a reminder that the conversation is being recorded for both the people in the room and folks online. Before we dive into the agenda, I want to pause and see if Arushi, our Vice Chair, wants to say anything, or Commissioner McAdams, or any of the Commission staff.
Well, let's start with Commissioner McAdams.
Yeah.
I just want to congratulate everybody on a successful launch to the pilot. The data coming in is truly it's encouraging for me. I think we've made a solid start. I think this meeting is important because it'll be our first chance to identify the obstacles for everyone as they try to more efficiently sign up participating premises and/or infrastructure or administrative challenges that our utilities are running into, and effectively absorbing this new demand. And everything that we do now, the world is watching, and I look forward to solving these problems. So good luck, everybody.
I guess I should tell everybody that tomorrow, Secretary Granholm, Friday morning, Secretary Granholm is going to be here in Austin, and she was originally coming here for South by Southwest, and some of her team at DOE have happened on the cool work we're doing in Texas, and started to try to figure out how we can scale similar projects across the country. Obviously, reliability being the core driver for getting these programs up and going. So she's hosting a private roundtable with the task force leadership, Commissioner McAdams, and a few other stakeholders in Texas. And it's just really a feather in a cap for our group and for this whole team that we have somehow become the first market that the DOE is, trying to learn from to scale this kind of program nationwide. So that's great. I want to make sure you all know. I don't know if there will be press, but if there is any, I'll make sure that I send it around to the group.
Thanks, Ruchi. So yeah, I think you all know, I've said this a couple of times, we're doing excellent work ahead of where other parts of the country are, and I do think that folks all around the country and beyond are watching what Texas does. That's why we wanted to have this discussion about what's going well so far. Where are we so far? And what are some of the impediments to continuing to fully subscribe phase one of the pilot? Because we also ultimately need to talk about what phase two of the pilot looks like, but I don't think we're quite ready to have that discussion until we fully understand phase one and how we can make it the most successful, so that we can prove that the work that we're doing is on track and is good for customers and market participants alike. So with that, why don't we jump into the agenda? We're going to first hear from ERCOT, and then you've got the other groups that will follow. I sent around an email to task force about some legislation that's pending. I would like to talk briefly about that at the end, just to get the task force members and other interested stakeholders on the same page on next steps. So that's not on the agenda, but I would like to cover that before we break today. So unless anyone has an objection, we'll turn it over to ERCOT.
Cool. And I guess just for some housekeeping, I have presentations from ERCOT and from Armada, but if anybody else has a presentation.
That one.
Okay, if you want to go ahead and share it from your screen,
Sure.
that's fine too. And if you want to also, when you're presenting, you can turn your camera on so people know what you look like. But with that, we'll start with ERCOT.
know what I look like.
And there should be little microphones on each of the.
By Kenneth and I, so hopefully folks want to confirm they can hear me on the phone.
Yeah. Oh, and then the mute button is for the whole telephone system, so don't mute it, please. Yeah.
Good. I apologize, I didn't bring my computer, so I don't have a camera for you all to look at me, so you can find a picture online and hopefully enjoy as I talk through the presentation here. So what I'm really going to focus on is just talking about what we're seeing so far in terms of people signing up to participate in the pilot. And from there, I'll jump into some of the things that we've seen so far with folks who are submitting the details of the aggregation form or the DOTA form. Really, I wouldn't say that many of the issues we've seen are major problems. I think it's just been a little bit of a work through of understanding, and of course there's various processes that just kind of folks have to go through. So it seems like things that have been fairly easily resolved through some iteration with the folks who are submitting the forms. But I'll get to that in a moment. I guess first just want to kind of talk about what we're seeing so far in terms of people signing up. Clearly there has been a lot of work going on in the last several months of, people working with customers, people working with the distribution service providers to try and get the forms in order. I guess we've really seen a lot of momentum in submissions in probably the last 2 or 3 weeks, and are happy to say as of yesterday, we have 7 approved DOTA forms. So that's really seven resources we're talking about. In terms of the total megawatts, I have it up here. I think there's 6.5 megawatts. And that 6.5 megawatts is looking to participate in non-SIN with about 2.2 megawatts of that total capacity. So I guess it's probably worth noting that to some degree these numbers are preliminary, specifically the non-SIN qualification, because there'll be a whole other process that we'll have to go through as part of broader qualification to see what folks are able to provide. One of the other interesting things to note as we've looked at these forms come in, we're seeing some diversity in the types of devices that are being included in aggregation. So we're seeing synchronous generators, we're seeing stationary batteries, and we're seeing HVAC systems. So I think there was some question as we thought about who is going to be participating and wanting to see some diversity in these aggregations. At least so far, we are seeing some of that, and that was a positive thing to just kind of take note of as we started to see these forms come through. I guess the other thing I want to sort of call out is we have the graphic here sort of showing where those megawatts are. There's the megawatt quantities, and then I put some numbers in parentheses. Those are the number of distinct ADERs we have in those different regions. So I think the biggest one we have is up in the north region at 2 megawatts. That's a singular ADER that we have. There's a 0.8 megawatts in the south part of in the south load zone. Consisting of 2 distinct ADERs, and where we're seeing the most ADERs total right now is in the Houston load zone, both in terms of megawatts, 3.7, and the number of resources we're seeing at 4. So again, these numbers are to some degree preliminary. Obviously, this is what we're seeing in the form, and we'll see where we get when we get through qualification. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of the next steps as well, but again, really a lot of strong momentum here in the last couple of weeks in getting these forms in and seeing some potential for participation here in the very near future. Next slide, please. So I guess the one thing we just wanted to talk about is sort of where we stand relative to the participation limits that we set when we came up with the Phase 1 document. So for folks who may not remember, we had a system-wide 80 megawatt total capacity level for participation in the pilot, as well as a 40 megawatt total for what we would allow in terms of non-spin at the system level. And for the purposes of ensuring we had some diversity in participation, we had taken those system-wide limits and split them across the load zone, and this was based on a load ratio share calculation. If I remember, Kenneth, we had used the share in August as just sort of the barometer to use, and we didn't see that changing very much, but wanted to come up with an easy, transparent way to sort of divvy up those megawatts across all the different load zones. So I've obviously mentioned we have the 3 so far that we're seeing these forms come in. We're updating the spreadsheet as we see approved details of the aggregation form. And in addition to that, obviously sharing the presentation here, but we did post an updated spreadsheet to the ERCOT website on the page for the pilot yesterday afternoon, I believe. So as it stands right now, of course, not really near any of the limits we have set. And of course, we'll keep tracking this, and particularly as we see participation. I know one of the things that we talked about within the governing document for Phase 1 is, as we see participation and as we get close to these limits, there is some flexibility to consider expanding it beyond what was originally set. So not a step we need to worry about now, but it's just something that, of course, we can keep an eye on in the future.
Could you remind the group, would an expansion require a governing doc change, or did we build in flexibility to expand without that?
We had built it so that it did not require a change to the governing document.
That's what I thought, thank you.
Yeah, so the way it was, Linda, it would be certainly a sort of a decision by ERCOT in consultation with the task force is the way that we had written that within the governing document. So any questions? This is really kind of talking about participation. We're sort of very early stage. Of course, we're probably a month and a half maybe away from actually seeing folks participate. Really kind of going through, now that we have these approved forms, folks going through the full registration and qualification process. But this is sort of want to lay out, and again, we are now having the opportunity to see some of these forms come in. So any questions on participation before I talk about the forms?
Yeah,
Sorry, you want over here first, please.
I was wondering which load zone the non-spin has already been approved is in?
So if you look at, it's actually, that was what the bottom half of this table is. So that is actually, the top of the graph is looking at what the total capacity is and how that's sort of split up. The bottom half is looking at the non-spin. I believe there's some amount of non-spin in all 3 of the zones. And it sort of matches what we saw in terms of energy with the one that's filled up the most is load zone Houston with 13% of that 40 megawatts of non-spin.
So for all the 2.2 megawatts that you mentioned in the last slide, which load zone is that in?
So that's split up across those 3. So yeah, and that's actually the second row in the non-spin section. So 1.3 megawatts of the 2.2 is in Houston, 0.6 is in load zone north, and the remaining 0.3 is in load zone south.
So one other, all 7 that have been approved and accepted, all of them indicated that they wanted to do non-spin.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah, that's good clarification. Thank you.
Can you remind us where these where they map to in terms of the process flow? You mentioned you still have some testing to do, so these are aggregations of EZIDs that y'all and the TDUs have vetted, they've registered with the commission, and now you're getting into the actual testing of the capability. So are they already SCED qualified but not non-spin qualified?
So right now, all we have for these resources is an approved DOTA. So they have not gone through the completed registration. They're not necessarily in the model yet. Okay. And they won't, it will be after they're in the model, then of course that we will get into SCED qualification and non-spin qualification. So right now, you'd have to say these are all preliminary based on the approved DOTA forms. Okay. I would generally anticipate that the megawatt capacity is probably fairly firm. Maybe there's a little bit more of a question mark in the non-spin, but I guess we'll sort of see how that plays out. My expectation is as we go through qualification, if we do see some discrepancy in terms of what we had in the form, we'll probably actually want to get the DOTA approved to reflect that to some degree. We'll have to maybe think through a little bit of that, but the idea would be that we could potentially update it to reflect sort of actuals post-qualification, but our general rule, certainly to start, is that we are updating that once the DOTA has been approved and sort of using that as the primary point of record for the tracking spreadsheet.
And I remember in the aggregate load resource document, and I can't remember if this was mapped over into the ADER pilot document, there was a notion that ALRs would maybe register a little bit more than what they're looking for, to have some headroom to grow, not have to change the registration frequently. Does it take into account some headroom of the?
Yeah, and I'll actually talk about that a little bit, in, if you want to call it lessons learned, is the thought that, and again, we'll talk about, but the idea is that the DOTA form would generally reflect the physical capability of the ADER, and of course, there'd be some expected churn as people add, or updates as people add, new premises, new customers as part of their particular program. And in fact, one of the entities is already sort of worked in parallel, getting the DOTA form together and starting registration, and to get sort of into the model process. We're making a little bit of distinction with the DOTA. We want to ensure that it reflects sort of physically what are the premises that are involved in the ADER today. Within the registration, we are expecting an okay with some additional headroom, whatever you like to call it, to accommodate the fact that we're expecting these to grow. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Questions?
JT, other comment, question, okay?
Okay, sorry.
Can ERCOT confirm what assets can participate? Talking to several co-ops this week, they were told that only BESS can participate, thermostats cannot.
No, I guess that's not correct. The one thing that we had said as part of the governing document is that, to the degree an aggregation was entirely made up of demand response type devices, we already have the aggregated load resource program, so that we don't need a pilot for that, right? We have a program stood up for these aggregations of demand response type devices. So we did not want, and we are not expecting to approve an aggregation that's entirely made up of demand response devices. That being said, things like thermostats, and I mentioned we do see some HVACs being included. If they are included in the aggregation that expands beyond those types of devices, that would be allowable under the pilot program, and we are seeing some of that already.
But the key, Dave, I guess, is some of the sites within the ADER have to have the capability of pushing energy to the grid. It can't be all DER.
Yes, that's exactly right.
See, Resme has her hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So Dave, earlier you said generation is also there. So I wanted to check, can backup DG provide it? And if so, are they able to meet updated desired base point? Is that a requirement? Because a lot of older these emergency generation are just switch on and off. And how do ERCOT put a requirement that they have to follow, like they cannot ramp fast, they have to ramp 4 seconds to reach that 5 minute in the sked?
Yeah, so I would say from the generator type you're mentioning, there's no specific prohibition on those types of resources participating. As part of the overall pilot, these are participating as sort of quasi-controllable load resources and following SCED base points. So there is going to be a requirement, they'll be scored as such as we get into performance, that they're following that 5-minute ramp from one. And the terminology within the ERCOT protocol is the updated desired base point that Resme is referring to, but people will be able to follow that ramp. So that would, of course, if people have some issues trying to do that, that may be a reason to aggregate with other devices so you can do some smoothing. And I know people have sort of raised this idea to us of perhaps some of the devices are a little bit blocky, is maybe the right way to say it, but hoping to try and smooth that with other devices within the aggregation. And that's sort of how we anticipate, if there are these more blocky types of devices, that would be managed. But overall, on the aggregate, we're expecting the ADER to follow that 5-minute ramp from one base point to the next.
Yeah, those resources are SCED able to follow the 5-minute dispatch, but not the UDBP. So if they are not able to aggregate with other smoothing things, can you think about if it is okay to allow that because you have at one point talked about blocky resources not providing PFR and being able to provide the non-spin.
Yeah, sure. So again, for phase one, the way it's laid out is that they are going to be looked at in terms of performance or being able to follow that 5-minute ramp. We had listed as part of the things we were going to analyze within phase one. Certainly to the degree we see this being a barrier for participation is could we look to expand this, particularly if we had some more time to even perhaps make some changes to our system to allow and accommodate participation of aggregations of devices that were more blocky in nature, maybe looking something more like our load resources that are not falling into the controllable bucket. But in part because we were trying to utilize the existing functionality, it is following the controllable load resource paradigm and performance measure. So again, that will be an expectation for phase one, and we'll see. And of course, maybe some feedback that people bring up today that we're already seeing that as a barrier for participation.
Yeah, we are seeing that. So yeah,
Okay.
we can talk later.
Rishni, we asked for this workshop for stakeholders to file comments on barriers, challenges, et cetera. So that's not just directed to folks that are actually already participating, but to also talk about these things that if there is a barrier that your company is seeing to participating, file comments about it, so as a task force, we can collectively address those in our report. And that report then becomes procedurally the vehicle for potential revisions proposed for the governing document to our cost. We'll go through that process again, but that's kind of the point of us trying to collect those comments, both verbally today, but if you also file them, that will help us create the record for our quarterly report as well.
Thanks.
And by the way, I guess I did see one last comment, and if there may be other questions folks have, but there was a question about posting it. I guess my understanding, Jason, is that we are going to file all of the presentations as a single package after.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right, yeah. We'll get that on file either later today or tomorrow, so that everybody has access to it. I did have a question, Dave, on, I think you mentioned that it might be another month or so before we see the aggregation actually putting energy on the grid and providing ancillary services. Is that about right in terms of what y'all are seeing?
Yes. So, and we'll kind of touch upon this a little bit too. Right now, and in fact, I mentioned one of the entities that talked to us about trying to do both the DOTA form and the registration through the system called RIO within ERCOT. That's how folks, it's our interface through which people are registering units. They had worked to do some of that work in parallel to try to expedite it. There is once you get into the registration process, about a 45-day timeline from getting into registration to when you actually see now a resource in our model that can begin to go through that qualification process, and then obviously post-qualification start to participate actively in the wholesale market through energy and ancillary services. So I guess right now, I would expect, hoping to see participation in more of the maybe mid-April timeframe, including the qualification timeline.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Dan Johnstein, do you have a deadline for that, submitting comments you asked for?
No. No deadline. But we will issue a quarterly report. So from that perspective, for the first quarter, I guess we should try to get a report out end of month-ish. We have the actual task force meeting occurring on March 22. So that will be sort of our kind of capstone meeting where we'll discuss comments filed to date, and try to provide an outline of what we expect to agree on and have consensus on in the report as a task force, and then go from there to actually publishing it next.
All right, so I guess from that slide, and maybe we'll touch upon some of the topics. I'm sure folks want to talk a little bit more about the process and things like that and next steps, and I think we'll cover some of that. But for the next couple of slides, just going to talk about some of the items that came up as people started to submit forms. And again, I would say these all feel relatively minor in the scheme of things, but it's just the process that we've been working through there's a lot of entities involved, and it's an entirely new process, so there was just some growing pains. I guess the first thing that has come up, and to some degree I've laid out these lessons learned or items more as sort of our expectations, and then hopefully that'll kind of stir some of the conversation. In the way that we saw the forms coming over is, as folks may remember, there's the spreadsheet that has all the premises and some other information of what this ADER is going to look like. There's also some signed forms from the QSC as well as the DSP. The way that we're hoping to see all of this and ensuring that everything's all in order is that the person who's going to be the QSC for this ADER, that they are the ones that sort of sending us this full package of material that includes not only just the DOTA, but any of the other sort of signed forms that were required as part of it. That just sort of helps ensure that everyone's in agreement that they've had a chance to go through it. Obviously, one of the big things for us is that to the degree there was going to be some iteration between the aggregator and the DSP, that a lot of that work had been done before, so we're not putting these things in the model, for example, and then finding out that the DSP actually doesn't like or is unable to accept some of those premises being included. So as part of that, that's just been something we wanted to try and set some more expectation for to ensure that everything's in order and everyone's in agreement before we kind of take those next steps within ERCOT. One of the other items as well is for each of the entities, we have specific authorized signatories. And we're expecting for the folks who are signing these forms, we are looking for it to come from those specific individuals in the company as sort of authorized representatives of those particular companies that can sign on behalf of them. So going to kind of bullet through, one of the things that was just kind of had to be worked through, in particular, because this is one of the items where a lot of people are involved, is within the DOTA form, there was this information that we wanted to capture about for the premises, where were they technically in the transmission system that we at ERCOT are modeling. This is going to be particularly key when we get into analyzing our ability to manage congestion on the system. I think there were just some questions, and we were trying to figure out sort of who was responsible for it and how was that going to get filled out. Again, it took about 2 or 3 phone calls with various parties, but I think that's all sort of clear now, and I think that process has been working fairly smoothly beyond those first couple of phone calls. So just something for folks to keep in mind. If you are still looking to get your form in, if you reach out to the DSPs or you reach out to some of the others who will talk about their submissions, I think you can kind of figure out how that process worked, and I think it's going fairly well right at this point. One of the things that did pop up is, and this may just have been more of a timing thing, but we saw some instances in which there was a device included in the aggregation that was not technically associated with the person who's trying to do the aggregation. And so just there was some requests to go back and just review some of those and make sure all that was in order. And we did, I think, see at least one case in which a premise or a device in particular was participating in other program, specifically ERS. And I know we had tried to carve out within the governing document to say that we were really looking for devices that weren't otherwise participating in these other programs and being compensated through an ERCOT program. So again, that was something pretty easy to just sort of clean up. Next slide, please. One of the, I guess, other items that had popped up fairly early, and I think, again, this has been easy to resolve, is when we first saw some of these forms coming over, we saw premises that were not able to be included, that were flagged as rejected by the DSP as being part of the aggregation. And really what our anticipation is that as folks have gone through this iteration with the DSP, that final form that we essentially approve and get signed off does not have any rejections in it. And one of the biggest reasons for that is to ensure that, we're capturing information about the individual premises, but we're also capturing information about the aggregation, and we want to make sure all that's in alignment with what we're physically expected to be part of the aggregation. And so, again, that was just sort of a step that I don't think was clear, that I think has been clarified now at this point. This next one is very minor, just been a sort of a nomenclature, and maybe it's a real simple fix just to label a little bit better in the spreadsheet that is the form. But we had been anticipating that any information that was withdrawal information would be negative values, and so that's just been something that we've been talking to folks as they start to fill out the form. So something to keep in mind, and that can make, I think, an easy improvement to the DOTA form moving forward to clarify that for folks. The next one actually leads to or touches on, Ned, what you were bringing up. As we had talked about folks and getting into the next step of registration, there was this idea of, I'm expecting some things to change fairly quickly with this, and I don't want to go and actually update the network model and go through resource registration as often as the aggregation is changing. So putting a little bit of a fudge factor, whatever the right terminology is to create some headroom within that registration. We are certainly okay with that and have been seeing that with some of the folks that we've been working with on it. I guess that is distinct from what we were expecting in the details of the aggregation form, particularly as we talk about, that's the source of record we're using to track participation and relative to the limits in particular. And we'll obviously get into that with some of the performance as well. So anyways, we are expecting that to reflect as new devices and everything are added within the aggregation. We're expecting those updated details of the aggregation forms to capture what's physically in place right now, recognizing that there may be this bit of extra capacity, whatever you want to call it, within how the resource is registered to allow for that movement.
Dave, just a quick reminder, how often is a queasy allowed to submit DOTA, to updated DOTA?
We certainly talked about it being monthly. I think that was this particular cadence we had hoped for.
So if somebody joins the aggregation on the middle of the month, they don't get to count toward the capacity of the resource until the beginning of the next month, right?
Yeah. We specified in that DOTA form that it should be the first day of the month. We want things to show up as starting the first day of the month.
So you want to get the DOTAs in before the end of the month so that they can be ready to go by the first.
And I think a key part of that, Paul, too, was, again, part of that submission process is in a review and approval by the DSP. So certainly, we wouldn't want a case where the device is participating that hasn't been reviewed by the DSP. So I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah.
And then we might get into this later. I know Catherine has noticed that in the governing document, updates to this DOTA form should really come from the DSP. And we'll have to read through the governing document a little bit closer on how to do updates.
Yeah, and I guess just to be clear, and we'll touch on this again a little bit more, a distinction between the original submission.
Part of this is the first
Right.
brow. I just want to make sure you clarify.
I have the same brow too, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, we'll get into it later. I don't want to stop the presentation, but that's something we noticed that was in the governing document.
Yeah, but I do want to kind of do that clear line, because I just talked about on the previous slide. There's the initial submission where we're getting all of the agreements and forms, looking to have that from the QSE. The way it has been developed within the governing document, and I can't remember if this was specifically intentional or not, there's sort of a vision because of the different timeline for simply having updates, was that it would be coming from the DSP. The last thing that folks just want to be aware of, again, I think in general, most of the folks who are looking to participate have a fair amount of familiarity with ERCOT and getting resources registered with us, but there's a couple of things just for folks to be keeping in mind as they are going through, particularly the registration process before they actually go into the model. There's also this idea where they have to get set up with a QSE, and there's some QSE acknowledgement forms, so that qualified scheduling entity is going to be the actual entity who represents that resource within our systems. That's the entity that ERCOT communicates with to settle the resource, to dispatch the resource, all of those things. Any of these ADRs will have to have a QSE, and there's some forms associated with that. In addition, there's also something referred to as a decision-making entity. This can be technically not necessarily the same entity as a QSE, but this is another thing that has to be designated for any given resource that's participating in the wholesale market, particularly the resources that are participating in energy and ancillary services. This is essentially saying who's the entity who has the control and financial interest around the particular facility. And from a systems point of view, it's primarily used for things related to mitigation processes that we have within the market, but it's something that we have and collect and required to have more generally.
Just a quick comment that there is a resource DME list on the ERCOT website. And so actually, if you look at that list, a fair number of entities are the resource entity, and they are also the DME. And the reason that that's the case is that the RE is also the registered PGC that's performing all of the wholesale decision-making for the QSC. There's actually fewer cases where the QSC is the DME, which is kind of interesting. But that's a good tip to figure out who would be a DME for your ADER.
Yeah, if anyone's trying to find that list, it's on one of our market reports section. I think it's something that we produce daily that provides just the latest list of a mapping of all resources in the market to this decision-making entity. And I think it's actually called something like something control report, that is referencing the fact that these are the entities that have sort of that financial decision and control over the financial decisions of that particular plan. All right. So those are really the main topics related to the DOTA forms. Again, no showstoppers really what we're seeing so far with those DOTA forms. It just has taken some iteration and some growing pains. I guess above and beyond just the folks who have submitted these forms, we have just seen more general interest in people looking to participate. So just kind of wanted to share some of those questions. There's been questions, again, these are some folks who don't necessarily have resources in ERCOT before, they kind of don't know these various registration processes or who the heck the DME is or how a QSD is sort of associated with them. So there's been folks asking about these registration processes and who these entities are and trying to get more information there. Some folks have just sort of heard through the pilot and are interested, but have not been involved necessarily in task force, so just sort of asking for general information about where they can find things on the ERCOT website. Is there other things that they can find that have been filed related to the project at the commission related to the pilot? Again, for folks who haven't historically had resources in ERCOT, trying to understand what it means to have a resource participating in energy and ancillary services. So, for example, what are the types of submissions that they're expected to do? The current operating plans and telemetry are kind of the big ones that they're just trying to work through how that could potentially work and fit within sort of their technology and things like that they're thinking about. And this was less an item that we've heard from others yet, but just was something that came to our mind a little bit as we started thinking about the next steps of starting to share some analysis and performance and things like that is we really have specific rules around how we're able to disclose information. And we didn't really put any exceptions within the governing document for how we start sharing stuff. So, it'll sort of be a problem that we'll have to think about when we get a little closer, but if we see sort of single individuals participating, how we share that analysis, we'll just maybe have to be a little clever. So just want to kind of set the stage of, as we get into people wanting to see performance, how we share it maybe have to evolve over time as we see changes in participation. And to a degree, we do see that as a barrier. Maybe that's something we want to think about as part of a phase 2 governing document.
But in any case, you could disclose it in 60 days, right? Yeah,
so I guess, for folks who aren't familiar, there's a requirement around particularly sharing things about not necessarily technical specifications, but information about how any resource participated in the market. All of that sort of gets aired out into the public, but it happens 60 days after the particular operating day in which that transaction or behavior occurred. So that is just a limitation that we have right now, particularly if we see some cases in which it'll be sort of tough to share true aggregations of these aggregated DERs.
So Drew has a question online.
Howdy. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yep.
Excellent. So I just want to comment on the DOTA form. So, and John Paolino is going to probably cover this a little bit too, so I won't belabor it. Obviously, being both a DSP and a TSP at the same time, we have some issues. We don't have easy IDs. So we felt that we put together the best possible DOTA form possible, and we'll get those in shortly. But from an ERCOT perspective, do you see any challenges with a truncated form And you might have to answer this after we submit it, but if you can foresee any issues with the truncated form before we submit it, it will be helpful. As the ERCOT
And I guess,
question.
I'm sorry, and when you say truncated form, I'm assuming this is specific to the fact that you don't have an easy IDs, and to be sort of some other identified, I think we talked about some other unique meter identifiers. So is that what you mean by truncated?
Absolutely. We don't have SIM, we don't have easy ID. So, you know, we're not gonna, it's not gonna be, the data that ERCOT's gonna get is not gonna be nearly as voluminous.
Yeah, I guess we will have to kind of see the data to know for sure. I guess even in the case where there is not an easy ID per se, it seems like there's an expectation so that there will be a load within our network model that we can map whatever this unique identifier is. So I guess I don't have a good answer for you today on how we'll look at it, but we're happy to work with you as we get the forms in.
Okay, yeah, you know, we're gonna get those in shortly. I just this is the softening, if you want to make sure you're ready for it when you see it.
I always appreciate a heads up. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. All right, I have just one more slide unless there's another question. The next slide is just kind of really talking about next steps for folks. Obviously, we still expect more forms to come in, and it sounds like we have at least one in the very near future. But yes, go ahead.
Okay, we didn't mention this, but just so everyone knows who's listening to the workshop, RIO replaces the RARF forms. The RARF forms are still on the website. That's the Resource Asset Registration forms. Don't use those. If you're trying to do this in RIO for the first time, you need to contact Dave or contact me or Jason, and we will get you to the right people, to the right group, in fact, that is managing RIO, which is a different group that historically managed the RARF. And they are a great team. They're very supportive, and they'll help walk you through this process. But RIO is brand new for the entire market. It is not unique to this pilot. Is there a RIO handbook out yet? Handbook? Like, not just
I thought they had put together some education material that was posted, but I don't know.
No,
I don't know for sure.
there's no handbook yet, right?
Okay.
So yeah, so we do have to go through that team.
Yeah.
Donald House and team, right?
Yeah, and for folks, it is the demand integration team that's supporting it, so it'll be some familiar names and faces. They've actually added some staff to kind of help not only with, of course, expecting some more registration through this pilot program, but just more generally seeing more registration and participation of demand side or load resources. And so there's been some expansion of that group to support it. Yeah, I will say, not at all related to the timing of the pilot there, we have been transitioning to this resource integration and ongoing operations, or RIO is the acronym, system specifically for load resources. We actually had transition for most generation resources prior. We were just now at the very end of last year, beginning of this year, transitioning to using that new interface for load resources, and of course that will be the bucket that ADERs fall in, given that we are modeling them as these controllable load resources. But yeah, to agree, it will be some growing pains for everyone, even for folks who may have more familiarity. So please do reach out to and we have the pilot projects at ERCOT.com email address. So if you use that one, that'll hit the full team, including these folks who are supporting the registration portion of it. So again, just as we start to see forms come in and get approved, now it's really time to get into registration. Again, I mentioned we have at least one case where the entity was sort of doing this in parallel, so they're a little further along the path. But for the folks who haven't, now that they have the approved form, looking to start to put their resources into this interface, into RIO. I guess I highlighted this before, but I'll say it again, and this is actually our expedited timeline. There is a 45-day window for resources once they get into registration to fully make it into our network model. This is just sort of all of the very regular network model changes that we're making because we're doing all that coordination across the full transmission model. There is a timeline that people may not expect to actually get their resource within the model itself. The other thing then, just to note, and I mentioned this as well, but just to put it in the bullet here, whereas for the DOTA form, we want that to reflect what's physically going on with the current premises making up the aggregation. We were expecting and can support some amount of additional cushion, I guess is the term we used here in the presentation, in the megawatts, so that folks, as they add additional customers or premises, that they're not necessarily required to go back and actually update this registration. Once we get to that point where folks have their resources registered, we're getting close to putting them in the model, then of course we actually now will be beginning to set up all the interfaces with them, including most importantly that real-time telemetry that really is going to be the basis on which we do all of the dispatch within our systems. We'll get into qualification for participation in SCED and non-SCED. And then, of course, there's the last item that we were talking about a little bit as well, is the monthly updates as needed to those DOTA forms as people are adding or removing or updating just the folks who are making up their aggregation. And as we noted, in the way that we were looking at the governing document and with the timeline, the expectation is that would be coming from the DSP, but I imagine that'll be part of the conversation we have for the latter part of this meeting today. So that's all the material. I know folks were asking questions throughout, but is there anything else before I turn it over to the next set of folks?
I guess one question for Mariah. When we submit the DOTAs, we also have to resubmit the PDC form to you with the DOTA form attached?
If you already submitted the aggregation form, you just need to submit the DOTA to us.
Okay. Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Dave. So we're going to go to the next part of the agenda, which is kind of a lightning round of comments from folks. As we transition to the next section, I should have mentioned at the top of the hour, but it is National Women's Day, which has been celebrated since 1911. And if you look around this room, we're not quite half women, but we're pretty close, which is a big change from if this meeting had been happening 10 years ago, especially 20 years ago. Thank you all for that little detour. I just wanted to acknowledge it before we finish the meeting. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to Martha to talk about TDU expectations.
One more question from Reggie. Any chance a link can be provided to the relevant control report that Dave mentioned?
Yeah, I guess I didn't bring, oops, sorry.
No, I can link it. I can do it from my phone. It's fine.
Yeah, we'll find it on the ERCOT website and put it in the chat. I'll work with someone who has a computer handy with them and find it.
What are we looking for?
It's the control report.
It's the ERCOT control report. So I can just link here.
All right, so Martha, and I'd ask for y'all to think about 5 to 10 minutes for each of the groups, because if we go beyond 10 minutes, we're going to run out of time. So.
Yep. Understood. This will be pretty quick. This is Martha Henson from Encore. So I collected feedback from the competitive area TDUs, so Encore, Centerpoint, AEP, and TNMP. So I'm speaking on behalf of all of them today, although my friends from the other utilities are welcome to chime in if I get off track. Each of us has processed at least one aggregation so far. And I think Dave actually hit the nail on the head. From my perspective, we're not seeing, major problems. There's just been little nitpicky things that we've had to work through with the submitting entities and ERCOT as well. So I guess what I wanted to share today was kind of two buckets of things. One would be general lessons learned from the processing of the DOTAs, and then the second one is just a couple of recommendations that we have in mind right now. So as far as lessons learned, we have had pretty good success communicating with the parties that are setting up the aggregations, the reps and queasies, and then also in particular with ERCOT, who's been very accommodating with us as far as helping us work through some of the form elements and questions that we had. As Dave stated too, we're finding that the governing document didn't cover everything, and so we've had to use these kind of ad hoc discussions with the submitting entities and with ERCOT to be able to process the DOTAs. But those have generally been pretty productive, and we've been able to successfully, from my perspective at least, work through some of the details that weren't explicitly covered in the governing document or that maybe were a little off in the governing document. ERCOT has actually incorporated multiple changes to the DOTA already that the DSPs have identified along the way, so they've been very good with that. And the reps and queasies have also been really helpful and responsive to questions that we've had about their submittals, and have really shown a willingness to have those discussions with us and work through issues with us. And so we really like to see that kind of collaboration continue. Because of our, current experience with the more mechanical details of processing the forms, I think we too think that the governing document probably needs some updates at some point. Not sure what the timeline for that looks like, but, some of these lessons learned and process improvements that we're talking about today probably would, necessitate some small tweaks to the document. I'm happy to collect those from the DSP perspective and bring them back to a future discussion. So as far as recommendations go, I think there's two main things that stand out to me. I think Dave also alluded to this. So there's confidentiality provisions in the protocols today, both for protected information and ERCOT CEII. The pilot program is, to me, kind of in a gray area. I think the DSPs, Encore in particular, me specifically, have gotten questions over the past months about what kind of activity levels we're reviewing and seeing as a distribution provider. And I feel uncomfortable sharing that, with interested people, because to me, the process of setting these aggregations up is kind of similar to a gen interconnect, where the transmission provider is working with an interconnecting resource. There's a lot of back and forth that's confidential and not, publicly available to the market. And so I think when we're looking at these from Encore, at least, we kind of have that hat on, that this could be competitive information that's really not able to be shared. But given that it's under the umbrella of a pilot, maybe there is something more liberal there that could be in place that would allow us to be a little more forthcoming to answer questions and provide data about some of the things we're seeing. That might become more important when we get to an analysis phase where the distribution providers are actually looking at the ADER behavior on their system and want to be able to share some of that data with the task force. Second thing is that, while we heard that there is, I guess, 7 aggregations now that ERCOT's received, as far as the customer population, I think we're not at a place right now, none of us are at a place right now where we have enough participation to meaningfully study the reliability impacts of this behavior on our system. So, depending on how the rest of the year goes and what else comes in through the door, it seems possible that it could make sense to maintain phase 1 for the duration of this year, because one of the things that was really important and described in the governing document is the distributions provider ability to study the behavior of these to their systems. We just don't have that yet. So those are the things I would share, and welcome CenterPoint or AEP to weigh in if there's anything else you guys want to add here.
Well, in terms of participation, is it more like load zone specific or like node specific in terms of like active resources within an area?
So I see it as a DSP, I see it as a load zone aggregation. I think ERCOT implements it differently in their model.
Well, right now, we're gonna be treating it as a load zone aggregation in terms of dispatch and pricing and all those types of things. Is the question more about how we're gonna manage, or about what type of diversity?
It was more like in terms of like concentrations of levels on your system, to where does it become meaningful? Like, is it if it's concentrated on like, one substation area, does that make it better than?
Yeah, absolutely. Concentration at a substation or a feeder in particular, a distribution feeder, would be really helpful.
Okay.
Right now, based on what Encore is seeing, it's just individual customers dispersed across the system, so there's not really a way to study the impacts of an exporting customer on a neighbor, because we just don't have that yet.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
In order to be able to have the reliability impacts, you need potentially greater scale, and so you said you might want to hold this phase 1, but it seems like to the extent that scale becomes a limiting factor in the future, it was smart to increase that as part of phase 1. Is that in line with your thinking? Like, once we get to that point, we're not there yet, obviously, phase 1.
Yeah, so there's a megawatt cap per load zone, right?
Right.
mean, it's a hard question to answer, Eric, because again, I think as a distribution provider, I'm not as worried about the load zone cap level as I am about specific local area concentrations, but I'd like to see some specific local area concentrations so I can study them.
So,
So I don't know that I don't know if you're saying raising the cap or moving to the next phase fixes the
I was
DSP's
just
issue.
suggesting raising the cap might lead to a situation where you can study something in a particular local area because you happen to get more in that area as we raise the cap and increase the total population. Potentially. I mean, because otherwise we might not get to the point where there's ever something to study because
Yeah,
it's so low.
I would just say, I think the cap was an ERCOT
I hear you.
recommendation, not a distribution provider recommendation.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So Resmi has a question online.
So it's related to what Eric was asking and to Martha. You wanted to continue the phase one longer. So is it more, the concern is more on the cap or the type of different service? And why I'm asking is because when we started having this discussion, there was more appetite for people wanting to provide responsive reserve than non-spin. And if the cap is the limit, then you could increase or you could open it up for responsive reserve as well to get more participation. And granted, all the other concerns of ERCOT has been met. So from a TDSP perspective, you want to continue phase one because of the to put that 80 megawatt cap continuous, or to keep it to just non-spin?
No, I mean, again, the cap doesn't really matter to me. The load zone cap doesn't really matter to me as a distribution provider. What matters is that I have something meaningful to study on my system, and I don't have that yet because the population I received is so geographically dispersed that there's no feeder level concentration that I can look at to measure behavior of. So
Okay,
I'm looking
it is
I'm looking
more
at a
of
granular
meeting.
level.
Yeah, it is more of meeting your milestone from phase one perspective, but you could go into provide from that perspective. It is okay if the resource is providing non-spin or responsive reserve, right? It doesn't matter. You just need that big concentration to do that study. Is that correct then?
Well, I think by definition, phase one was to start with non-spin, so we'd be interested in seeing some areas of the Encore system where there are customers providing non-spin in a concentrated area that we could evaluate, and that would help inform whether it's time to move to a paradigm, whether responsive is able to be provided.
If I can just add to real quick on the, again, I know the system-wide limitations were specifically requested by us. I think to a degree we get down the path where we start to hit some of those caps, and we find that sort of we're getting so much diversity geographically that we can't actually do some of the analysis that we want to see. That's certainly something we would take into effect, and that's why we had built in some of these rules about the ability to evaluate that. In particular, I think we also had the QSE level rule where we were trying to allow for some diversity and participation across multiple entities, and we specifically said if people have had some time and we're having some limits, we can rethink those. So I think it's really built around that language is really built around this potential concern if we get to that point sometime after we actually start to see some real participation in the market.
All right, we have a question from Joel and then a question in the room after that.
That's my boss, I think you.
So Joel, go ahead.
Hi, sorry I couldn't make it in person today. Just on the topic of megawatt caps, and this may be for an offline discussion, but you know, for Enchanted Rock's participation in the pilot, I guess like one of the things that we would like to kind of test in the pilot is the ability to use a number of resources in an aggregation to mitigate, performance risk across a portfolio. Because our assets are a little chunkier, the sites we're looking at to put in are 800 kW per site. I think we can't get very far in developing a robust portfolio given the current load zone caps. In particular, in the south load zone, we've got, over 13 megawatts available from 17 sites. And, we've got to run an optimization, I guess, based on what we're able to do. But I guess a general thing we're considering is the more assets we can put in, the more options we have to mitigate performance risk from the aggregation. So I think, certainly from our perspective, we'd like to have some conversation about what the cap might allow slightly larger assets on the sub 1 megawatt range.
Yeah, understood, and I think we can continue to talk about that. I mean, again, I think I will say just from our perspective and have wanting this limit in place to start is we haven't seen anyone participate yet. And so it's hard to say that I have any sort of comfort level at this point to be willing to move beyond what we have in place. But again, that is why we wrote it into the document, was that we would have this ability to review without having to go back to the board, just to give us flexibility both at ERCOT and in consultation with the task force here.
Thanks, Joe.
I just, and maybe you just answered it, but, and my question for ERCOT is, from what we just heard from Encore about their inability to sort of study this on their systems due to the lack of local concentration, have y'all, is this a kind of new information to y'all, or have y'all been thinking about that? And if you have, what ideas does ERCOT have to sort of maybe think about for future structures to allow for this more local concentration so that DSPs can study the effect on their system?
Yeah,
And sorry for putting you on the
no,
spot.
that's okay. I mean, I know that as part of the original conversations about the pilot was this fact that there was actually some dependency on there being concentration of customers participating to kind of to really do some stress testing. To be honest, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know what ERCOT can do to try to encourage concentration necessarily, and it's not, I will say, it's not really the limits that I'm aware of that are driving a lack of ability to hit concentration. I think it's, I guess I feel it's more about customers people are able to attract and whether or not they happen to be across the street from one another or not. But
Can I, I'm either gonna have a really dumb comment or a smart comment. We'll see which one it is. With ECRS, it's an energy service, right, an energy reserve service that looks like non-spin, but it's a 2-hour service instead of non-spin, which is 4. So in theory, what that means is that if 20 power walls, for example, have to be split over 4 hours to provide the non-spin service, if those same 20 power walls are providing the same service over 2 hours, isn't your system gonna get, isn't Martha's system gonna get more energy exports over a shorter duration?
if that's how the resource is participating in the market, yes.
So that it makes sense that, ignore the capacity and everything else, it makes sense to give more opportunity for the resources that are there, even if there are fewer in the system right now, a bigger opportunity to dispatch more capacity over a shorter interval.
I'm guessing we still don't see the concentration to really make a dent in the point that Martha's making.
Because what?
Because of the overall capacity itself is not sufficient to, I think, do some of that analysis, and it's not directly linked to the services that those units are potentially going to be providing.
The concentration is not physically there, or it hasn't been signed up. But I think we all, many months ago, thought this was a test case that we wanted to test. And I was having the same question. Are we going to get to the point where we have the concentration so that we can test what we want to test? And I don't think it has anything to do with the load zone limits. It's just, I guess, I would have thought there might have been some neighborhoods with some high concentration, and they all would have signed up, and there would have been
Yeah.
one substation transformer that saw some change, but I guess we're not seeing that yet.
So I want to keep the mic for a second. So something Alex Ramirez at AEP said at the beginning in our early task force meetings was this idea that across the load zones, the idea of the cap allocation inherently kind of dings the south zone on their overall number of megawatts that can come from that one zone. And if you think about the comment that Joel, you made, and the idea that we want more concentrated participation, one approach for us to think about for phase two, whenever that is increase the overall cap, and the individual participant cap is the same, the 20% is the same, you know, for one company. But if you increase it overall, then we could get more, hypothetically, more enchanted rock or more whatever in at least one more load zone, so you're just able to increase concentration on systems. And maybe it's even like for phase two, we haven't decided, I don't think even you have decided, or ERCOT, does all of the cap increase need to be proportionate or not to the other load zones? So if we aren't seeing anything in AEP for the next 4 months, and you want to be able to study something, is there a way for us to move up caps discretionary across different load zones? Just
Yeah.
to get to that result.
Yeah, I would say, and the proportionate passing around or allocating it out to the load zones was really just an intent with, and I'm not even sure this was ERCOT specific or just discussion with this task force, was a way to allow for diversity of participation and, you know, that we didn't have either single entities or single customer bases having an opportunity to try and participate in the pilot. But to the degree we find that the proportional allocation of the limit is causing us to not be able to study certain things or is unnecessarily limiting participation, that's certainly something that can be revisited. In fact, I think that wasn't even the first thing we had started with, is just where we landed based on some of that feedback and thinking about customer-based diversity.
So Suzanne has a question on whether the utilities can identify feeders where it would be helpful to have some concentration. I don't know if that's the right solution or not, but I think we've got the issue on the table, right? And that's what I want to make sure we do today. We won't solve any issues today. We need to get them all on the table, which means we need to move on, because we spent about 20 minutes on that one. And we'll never get to all the issues on that. It's not your fault, Mark.
Brief comment on that?
Yeah.
So, is ERCOT open to changing rules that we can get the concentration at circuit level or property level that we would need to study these things? Because, what Armada does is we cluster, resources into apartment complexes, multifamily units. And sometimes we see 300 units, 400 units, 500 units located, in one area, and sometimes there are multiple buildings, right? So that in itself could be, the cluster that we need, to study these things. But we're facing, and we're gonna address this later, but we're facing some challenges in participating, so.
Sure, I mean, happy to talk about what those challenges are. I mean, I don't have an intention to take a new governing document to the board at this point. But, you know, to the degree we want to talk about some of the ways that the current rules are limiting. I mean, again, that's exactly why it's a phase one, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what we just wanna get it out there, we can,
Yeah, so let's hear your specific issue, and then let's see what the rule is that we need to change.
Okay.
And I do think that there's, you know, we haven't really talked as a group about what phase two looks like, or if there's a phase 1B, that's before you get to phase two, right? So I think we can, after we get all the issues on the table, we can, decide what we want to do with them. But I think it's important that we continue to get them on the table. So Bandera, no.
Put me on the spot. Ready for that segue. Thank you. I'm John Padalino from Bandera Electric. Tiffany wrote me last week and said, is Bandera still willing to participate in the pilot or wanting to? And I said, oh, we're actively working on it, and we've been full thrusters since probably before the governing document was approved by ERCOT. I guess just to put things in perspective, as a reminder, I represent an electric cooperative, so we're a member-owned, locally owned utility out on the northwest side of San Antonio, in the best part of the hill country. We serve 28,000 members, that's 39,000 meters. So all this talk of concentration kind of makes me chuckle, because we're a lot of little pebbles over, square miles that would be the size of Delaware. So in that membership, we have 506 members who have DER, solar or battery. We have 2.2 megawatts of solar and 1.5 megawatts of batteries. When we looked at putting together our program, and it's our program, so Bandera Electric is the ADER, we're everything in that spreadsheet. We're everything as far as, except the QSC. We are the solar installer. We have the relationship with the members. We're going to aggregate the DER. And so it's been a lot of work. We've probably invested over at least one person's salary just to get to this meeting today. And we're still not there yet. So one of the first things we had to do was figure out what DER do we want to. There's been some nice manufacturers that we've talked to about the different devices that are in our system. And we decided we'd focus on batteries because we felt we've never sold power in the market. And so we wanted something that was a little easier to understand from a controllable device, something that we could measure, something that we could understand. And so when you look at the batteries in our system, we have 17 different manufacturers. So if we wanted all that 1.5 megawatts, a very small concentration, but if we wanted it all on the grid, if we want every megawatt on the grid, we would need to use some platform that could take in all those manufacturers. That platform is a DERMS, a Distributed Energy Resource Management System. And so we have been working with the DERMS providers. Of those 17 manufacturers, there's really two that make up a megawatt of that 1.5 megawatt. One makes up 2/3. They're very large, got a great marketing program, good public relations, all that stuff. We haven't been successful in working with them. The other part is 1/3 of that 1 megawatt that we've been working with that company. They've been great partners. If we had decided to plug directly into their platform, their API, we'd have 5-minute telemetry, but because we're working through a DERMS, our 5-minute responsive time, less than 5 minutes. So we'd be able to participate in on-spin or SCED. Right now, because we're going through the DERMS, we're losing a little latency. So right now, if we registered everything today, we'd probably only be able to do non-spin. What we have enrolled, and so that's a problem, just how do we get all the manufacturers to kind of play nicely, play fairly, so that, folks like Bandera Electric, and I'm speaking as Bandera Electric, I don't represent all the electric co-ops, but I have reached out to one that's about double our size, maybe triple our size, and they've had the same issue, where they can't access their full battery fleet, and one of them is really big. And if they could, they would have more ability to enroll, premises and devices. And so when we look at that smaller part of it, the 1/3 of the megawatt, that's 34 sites. We have 5 that have enrolled. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but that is almost 15% if you round up, and that's a great enrollment figure from a percentage base. So that would be, if ERCOT gave you a little education earlier today, if it's charging and discharging, it would be over 100 kW with what that capacity is, of controllable capacity. But we're not ready to register it because, there's other people involved in this discussion. And we're playing with our members' money. And so we have to be very conservative, small c conservative, and about what we do because we've never done it before, and we don't want to lose money. We're a nonprofit. We have a break-even proposition, and that's always the goal. So we need to be able to call more members. And so I'll just move on. The second obstacle has been enrollment, not just because we can't call all those members, but because even when we do, we're calling rural Texans, and I think urban Texans are the same. I mean, I know we've celebrated, but it doesn't sound like we're quite there in capacity yet as an overall program. And Texas buy batteries because we lose power in Texas. So we have hurricanes, we have ice storms, we have all kinds of stuff. And so most of our members have bought batteries because they want it for backup. And so when we've called them, I think they're fearful about, what are you going to do to my battery? Is it, what's it gonna do to my warranty? They spend a lot of money on their batteries, and they don't necessarily just wanna volunteer them for a program. We offer an enrollment fee, and if we ever get into the program and we charge and discharge, and they do it 80% of the time, we'll pay them another, amount at the end of the program. But that's what we heard on the phone. So we called those 34 people, and we have a good relationship with them. We called them in November and December, and most of them were just preoccupied with the holidays and said, call us back after the holidays. And right after in January is when we got the 5 to enroll. But I think, that is part of the problem. As a, installer and seller of distributed energy resources ourselves, we're thinking of other ways to increase that capacity out there, whether it's a rebate program, maybe establishing a leasing program. We're, putting pen to paper to try to figure out what might be one or more alternatives to increase the fleet out there. But that's been a problem, is really getting people just to enroll. I mentioned the latency and just being able to confidently participate when we actually get registered. I do want to call out our QSC is LCRA, so they're the 0% there. We hope to get a number on the board for you, Commissioner McAdams. And they've been great. Phil Wilson over there and the team has been very helpful teaching us about the process. We've had to negotiate a QSC agreement with them and all the particulars to get everything in place. All of our documents are ready. We just want to get a little bit more enrollment. And so, so we're kind of working that on the marketing to get more enrollment. We're trying to decrease the latency so we can play in the 2 parts of the market that are open right now. And then the last thing is on the M&V. We've improved our M&V platform so we can do the 2-second telemetry to report that. So that's been a real positive development, but it's been a struggle. And it hasn't been easy to get to here, but I think we're almost there. And so, hopefully in the next couple months, we'll be able to file our paperwork. And I guess with that said, I would echo the thought that it seems premature to be talking about phase 2 when no one's discharged at all in the market yet. So, and I think until all the manufacturers really start thinking about how they can work with, NOEs and that kind of deal, there'll be pockets of Texans that aren't able to play in this pilot.
Do you think that's one of the single greatest recommendations for the federal officials, like the Department of Energy, to be able to work through with our manufacturing sector to uniform those standards?
I'm a Texan, so I'm not sure that I would want the federal government doing anything. All due respect, I used to be a Fed. When I was in the government, I used to think to myself, the people are the problem. We have the technology, we have everything that is, it's just the manufacturers decided to say, hey, we can make this available. We'll work with you. We don't care about the size of your aggregation. We can make it affordable for you. That would be the single greatest thing to help us participate.
Okay. Thanks, John, for sharing that. Any questions for John? So, even though we live in this instant gratification world where we expect things to move really quickly, we aren't that far into the pilot, right? So I don't think it's that it's a problem yet. So we shouldn't feel like it's taking a really long time. Y'all done a lot of work. Drew, are you presenting for CPS? Yep.
I am. And
hold on just a second. Hold on just a second. Sorry.
Just listen about your experience in the PUC. That the contract between the you guys do with the solar battery, right? Kind of contract
With our members?
Yes, sir. Right. So how does that thing work in between a retail electric provider where there is a customer's choice, right?
We are not we are a non-opt-in entity. We are not an REP. We are in a non-competitive area.
So my question is, how does that thing work when there is a rep, right? When the customer wants to change their rep in middle of the time, right? So So how does that contracting work between that rep and, the third party? How easy it is for the customer to move or switch? Does anybody have any experience in that?
Well, the governing document requires that any given aggregation, that all of the participants are aggregated under a single rep or a single load sharing entity, I guess, generally, what you asked about the rep example, and that they're all under one QSA. So the agreements to participate in the pilot are therefore linked to the retail agreement in some way, and that's how they organize more people who are implementing what they're doing. So if a customer does change retailers, then they necessarily are removed from the aggregation as well.
Okay, my primary question was how these third party, providers like Berkshire or, how much cooperative are they with the rep?
It takes quite a bit of coordination there to make the offer work, the administration work, and all of that. That's a really good point.
All right, Drew, you're up. 5 to 10 minutes.
Excellent. Look, basically what John said, ditto. That is the kind of the core of what we're doing here. But what I want to do is something a little bit different, right? So I'm not going to talk about the administrative kind of process. What I want to cover with you is like, how are we actually going to do this? And then that way, you know, from an ERCOT perspective, or if anyone else, you know, wants to ask some questions, we can have follow-up conversations. But everything John said, you know, I completely concur. And because of that, we're taking a slightly different tact, right? And so we have a what's called a research battery. And what that's going to simulate is essentially kind of like a standalone support battery. Think Electrify America, maybe a battery backup system on a EVSE equipment that they want to bid into, bid into ADER, right? And so we're going to have a distribution system manager along with a virtual power plant manager that's going to look at the current state of our distribution system. They're going to understand the state of charge pre-bid process. And essentially, they're going to manage this in the stage one of our participation as if this is just this one single entity. And that's going to allow us to understand the requirements to make sure we can handle the reporting, to understand if we do have any gaps in terms of making sure from both a battery perspective as well as like a QSE perspective, if we're missing anything. And we are looking at working with other providers to help us on, administratively. But we think, at least initially, this is the pathway forward. Can everyone see my screen? Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. Stage 2 for us is to incorporate premise storage, and, in swaths and grow. We want to make sure that we maintain the customer experience, and we want to be very cautious about how we approach it. But we're going to do this within kind of the framework of phase 1 of the pilot, right? And so we're already working with potential providers to bring in premise level storage, from our customers to bring on this pilot over the course of phase 1. And it's going to be a crawl, walk, run approach. We're going to use our current PCI and GMS system to both manage kind of the offers and settlements, as well as to actually dispatch this resource. The beauty, I think, of what we've designed is that this is very simple, and ERCOT has been very gracious in taking kind of an all-comers approach to it. But the real, what we're looking at is, okay, it looks great on paper. Let's test it. Let's, as part of this pilot and kind of see what we come out with. One great professor once told me, like, you learn more from failure than you do from success. I expect to see a lot of failure, and that in itself is success. So I just want to cover that. I was going to cover, enrollments and all the other stuff, but I think John kind of covered that and some of the challenges we have as a NOE. Like I said, I think all that was covered. Future state, we have other concerns that we manage kind of, we have the largest DR program in Texas. I think we have over 270 megawatts. So we aren't unfamiliar with kind of these processes and dealing with DERMS types, systems. So what we really want to focus on is just the integration and making sure that we work well with ERCOT. And we're kind of looking forward to it. So with that, I'll pause. I don't want to take up too much time and take any questions if you have any.
Andrew, this is Alex with AEP. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Andrew, so I just want to make sure my interpretation is accurate. So I'm looking at the slide. Is your model proposing, or I guess the scope is looking at installing a battery that's a utility scale battery? So this would be on the primary side, not behind the meter. Is that correct?
So it will. This is a battery that we operate at Southwest Research Institute. So it is behind a node, and that node is swervy. So it is behind a meter. So it does look like a premise.
Gotcha, but it's not with load, right? It's a standalone tie to the system?
I guess I don't understand the question. It works, so you can think of this looks just like a Powerwall, just a very big one.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew.
Any other questions, Richard? Thank you for sharing that. Resume put some lessons learned from Shell in the comments. I won't read through them, but folks can take a look at that for this input. I believe now we are going to hear from Tesla. All right.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much. I think I can go pretty quickly because we have a lot of updates that and lessons learned that I think have been articulated already. And that's good that we're seeing that kind of convergence on how this is played out. In terms of where we are in the ADER process, we do have accepted DOTA forms and the QSE registration packet for a few different ADERs in ERCOT.